These are uncertain times. How do you manage when you don't know what the future is going to bring? There is a tool that enables you to set strategy for uncertain times and to manage in these times. Strategy has three elements: who we are, our strengths, our weaknesses, who we want to be, our vision, and then an understanding of the world within which we're doing business. And this is what we're going to talk about now: how you understand what could happen in the future and how you set a strategy to be prepared for that. Your mental models, what's in your head, determine what you do. This is the map that was given to the early Spanish explorers when they headed west, north, out of the Caribbean, out of Mexico. It was not bad. If you look at Florida, if you look at the Yucatan, the Caribbean, you got it pretty right, until you get out to California, where you have a little problem. Literally, the first guys to cross the Sierra Mountains carried boats. They dismantled longboats, strapped the boards to the sides of burros, and carted them over the mountains because they knew they were going to find a beach. Well, they found a lot of sand. And they wrote back to the King of Spain and said, California's not an island. And back came word, yes, it is. That's what the maps say. What are the maps that are in your head that are wrong? We all have them. And frequently it's people who are most expert who have the maps that are most badly out of date. So the president of one of the early computer companies, who didn't think any of us would have a computer in our home, IBM forecast for the sale of personal computers. Yeah, well, they undercast that one a bit, but not nearly as badly as McKinsey got the estimate for the market for mobile phones. They were only off by a factor of 120. If you look at history, it's a story of surprises. Oil prices have gone up, down, sideways. I'm old enough to remember when the Berlin Wall was just a reality. None of us ever thought that it would come down, or that Trump would be elected, or that a cough could contaminate the entire world. The future isn't predictable, and yet you must act. You have to manage a company, make decisions for your life. What do you do? Here are some of the recent surprises that kind of caught us all a bit off guard. What's next? I don't know. It's going to be a surprise. This book was the #1 bestseller on Amazon for all of 2007, Black Swan, by Nassim Taleb. Taleb, despite being insufferably arrogant, created a phrase that is now universal throughout business. He says everything that matters in history, in business, and in your life, you didn't think of until it happened. He takes the title from the story that in the old days, swans were white until some fool bumped into a black swan in Australia. And they said, oh, that's not a swan, swans are white. Until the ornithologist said, sorry, it's a swan. At which point they said, oh yeah, we knew that. Taleb says, everything that matters is like that. You didn't think of it until it happened. Unlike the bird, it changes everything. And he said these low probability, high impact events are accelerating. He says the winners will be those who grasp this idea, gain the capacity that when one of these things pops up, they go, ooh, swan, and then rigorously exploit them. So how many of you would have invested in these guys? particularly the 13-year-old down in the corner. Our typical response to uncertainty is to deny its existence or to analyze it to death. This man, Pierre Vac, a disciple of the Armenian mystic Gurdjieff, developed a different way of looking at uncertain futures. He worked for Royal Dutch Shell, the big oil company, and he put together a group called Group Planning to look at different possible futures. He called them scenarios. He hired this man, Peter Schwartz, to run Group Planning, and Peter did for over a decade. Peter wrote a book, and if this stuff fascinates you, I highly recommend Peter's book, The Art of the Long View. This man, Jay Ogilvy, worked with them. I worked with all of these gentlemen. They were able to do a great deal of good for Shell. In the 1980s, everybody was predicting that the need for oil would just go up forever. And the big companies were investing in the drilling equipment. Here's what actually happened. Shell became the world's largest company by seeing that this was possible. And by selling off their drill rigs when they saw the early indicators that, well, yeah, this possibility is actually playing out. When Shell was expert at scenario planning, they were able to understand a great deal about the geopolitics of the world. And if you run a global company, this is an important advantage, to the point that they were actually not surprised by glasnost and the fall of the Soviet Union. They were even able to predict who would wind up running it. Shell has now gone back to doing scenario planning, and you can go online and get the Shell scenarios. This is a composite of their 3 most recent scenarios: sky, mountains, ocean. This is why Shell does scenario planning. It gives them room to maneuver. They see stress starting to happen, and intolerable stresses mean something is going to change. It is a driver of change. And if you can see it coming, be ready for it in the crisis, you can alter course and go forward. If you don't, you get trapped. And then ultimately, after a crisis, you either quit nibbling at the bullet and write off a lot of assets, which in fact the big oil companies are doing right now, or you get into decay and you collapse. What is a scenario? It's not a forecast. You don't say, this is the future. Instead, you recognize that there are a lot of different mental models of what's going on in the world. You explore them all. And you then tell the stories of alternative futures. A scenario is a plausible, divergent, mutually inconsistent story that you can use to organize how you think about the world. It's a story about what might happen. And that's one scenario. You build a bunch of them so that you have these divergent stories, and you use them to test your strategy. Shell always sought strategies that were, they said, robust. They looked for no regrets strategies so that they wouldn't care which of these futures played out. They were prepared for any of them. They're just a tool, but they're a very powerful tool, particularly if you get them customized to context, if you build the scenarios for you. not for some other company that you don't really know, so that they are useful to guide your strategy, your thinking. Here's how you do it. You pick a focal issue. Pick one. What's the question that most matters to you now? From that, you identify the key factors. These are things internal to your company and the business you're in. You then seek to understand the environmental forces. These are external to your company. From these, you develop critical uncertainties. What do you not know that really matters? From that, you're able to begin building your scenario matrix. That gives you the different scenarios that allow you to tell these stories. The stories all have implications and options. You can make different choices. You look for early indicators that this scenario is what's playing out, not this one. From those early indicators, if necessary, you go back and do another set of scenarios. Or you say, right, our strategy is robust, and you get on with business. So again, focal issue, forces and factors, critical uncertainties. You construct a matrix, typically of 4 separate scenarios. You can do 3. You don't want to do 10, that gets unwieldy. You then tell the stories and learn from it. So, focal issue. Ask people throughout your company, what is the problem that you wish to consider? Be sure to talk to your management. Define the time and place. Is this for the whole world? If you're a company like Shell, yeah, it's the whole world. And Shell, when they were doing these, wanted to know everything about everything. The state of female literacy in Africa, healthcare in China, because they ran their business around the world. What are the long-range consequences that you're dealing with? All of these help you determine the focal issue. What's at stake? Your timetable. What are the mental assumptions, the mental maps that you're bringing to this? And then write a statement, 15 words or less. It's far less important that you get exactly the right focal issue than that you state that issue precisely. So a common one right now might be, how can my company thrive in a pandemic? Key factors. These are things all around you. It's the business you're in, your company. Empty the barrel of the obvious. People say, yeah, well, everybody knows that. Write it down. Not everybody knows that, and it may turn out to be important. The forces. These are things external to your company. Shell used what they called STEEP: social, technological, economic, environmental, and political. And there are other ways of phrasing this concept, but this will work. Look for the causes of the causes. What's driving this particular social phenomenon? Ask the unkunks, the unknown unknowns. Well, how can it be unknown if you can talk about it? It's the process of trying to uncover what is it you don't know that you don't know that you don't know that gives you these insights. And then try pairing these things up to see if you're finding some interesting connections. Look for the story of the decade. So in the 90s, the story was growth, the tech bubble until around 99, the dot bomb. Until 2001, the war on terror. Until 2007, 2008, the financial collapse. 2016, Trump. What's the story of the decade or the half decade of this time period that we're in? I mean, right now, the pandemic. These are some of the drivers of change that you're dealing with wherever you are in the world, whatever company you're running, you're dealing with these. List them out. 25 to 30 key factors and environmental forces that are most relevant to the problem you've decided to wrestle with. And when you start writing them out, don't critique them, just write them all out. You can then begin to narrow it down and decide which ones really matter to you. So again, most companies, when they do strategy, look only at themselves. It's like living in a Mylar balloon. Everywhere you look, you just see yourself. The world's not like that. You have a lot of influence over your company. You have little less influence over your entire industry. You have very little influence over the world at large. All of those have influence on you. So the factors, your industry, your company, things like market size and growth, customers, competitors, suppliers, all of the factors that pertain to you. The forces, again, steep, social, technological, economic, environmental, and political. From this list of forces and factors, try to identify two critical uncertainties. What is it that you don't know the answer to and that really matters? So I have no idea who's going to win next year's Super Bowl. Do I care? Not really. You're looking for uncertainties that are really uncertain and that are really important. If you want a guide to what this process looks like, Peter Schwartz recently did a set of scenarios with Salesforce and Deloitte. And you can go online and get this document. They're looking at the pandemic. This is their focal issue. And they have a time frame of 3 to 5 years. They identified two critical uncertainties. How bad is it going to be? And is there going to be collaboration within and between countries? These two, they felt, were the two most important issues that they were dealing with in the case of these two companies. When you have these two critical uncertainties, you build a 2x2 matrix. This gives you 4 separate worlds. So pick 2 and go. And you may look at them and go, oh, that's not very interesting. Well, then pick 2 more. It's iterative. You want your critical uncertainties to be opposites. You want the ends of your uncertainties to be opposites. So something is many, fast, few, slow. These should be unrelated to each other, not interdependent. In the case of the Salesforce exercise, these are the 4 worlds that emerged. So again, remember, level of collaboration, severity of pandemic. And they came out with these 4 separate scenarios that they wanted to tell the story of. Name your scenarios. So they picked the passing storm. The pandemic's not bad and everybody cooperates. Lone wolves. The pandemic goes on for a while and nobody much cooperates. The pandemic goes on for a while, but you have more cooperation. The pandemic is not all that bad, but you don't have a whole lot of cooperation. The purpose of all of this is to enable you to develop strategy to deal with uncertainty. Getting your critical uncertainties and describing them is what gives you a good matrix. A good matrix is what gives you good scenarios. Good scenarios gives you better strategy. So don't get hung up along this process. Again, pick a couple axes and try it. Once you've run this process, you can do it over again. Once you learn this, you can actually begin to run scenarios on the back of an envelope for almost any situation that you're dealing with. Obviously, you have a lot less information about the forces and the factors, but this is a fairly easy process to run. Once you have your matrix, test it. Does it give you 4 worlds that are interesting? Sometimes Shell winds up with only 3. One of them isn't terribly interesting, or one of them is business as usual and they decide not to write that out. Again, it's iterative. Just get on with it. Ask yourself, in each of the quadrants, do I see a discrete world that is plausible? Could be, makes sense. And it's very different than the world next to it. Are the stories that come out of these worlds interesting? And do they address your focal issue? If not, pick another couple of critical uncertainties, build another matrix, and go again. Here is a set of critical uncertainties that I often use when people are learning scenario planning. Tony Seba is right that by 2030, the world will be 100% renewably powered, or no, Tony's wrong. Fossil fuel is going to continue to rule. The economy is booming, the economy is weak. If Tony's wrong and the economy is relatively strong, you have business as usual. If the economy is strong and Tony's right, you've got the Green New Deal. If Tony's right and the economy is weak, you start having stranded assets and companies start getting into trouble. If Tony's wrong and the economy's weak, we're in a climate emergency. Well, we are anyway, but it begins to look pretty dire. This, if you're in the business of energy or environment or managing institutions that deal with these issues, this is a very plausible set of scenarios to begin playing with. Here are a set of scenarios developed by this company, Simplify Power. They're a battery company. They thought the question is, do we have batteries everywhere? Everybody becomes decentralized, or the grid remains pretty much as it is. Big power stations, big centralized energy. The economy is strong. We're heading into an economic collapse. To them, these were the 2 critical uncertainties. They came up with business as usual, the Green New Deal, tribalization, fortress world. Fortress world, by the way, is a term that was used by a set of scenarios created by the Great Transitions Initiative. They then assigned who on their team was going to work on each of these scenarios, answering the questions. What does it feel like to live in each of these worlds? What What's the world out there going to be like in 5 years' time? They wrote the New York Times headlines every 6 months for the next 5 years. And this is what you will do once you have these scenarios. So build a set, test them. Are they interesting? Is there a business as usual scenario? I mean, the world as it exists now came to be. So it is by definition plausible. It's here. Whatever exists is possible. This is a set that Shell came up with. They were interested in what's the price of fuel and what's in people's heads. Is this going to be a more spiritual world, a non-material world, or is it going to be traditional values of the world we have today? And so they came up with these 4 worlds related to cars. Engineers challenge, green highways, foreign competition, long live Detroit. We're all building muscle cars. 4 very different worlds based on these 2 critical uncertainties. Here's a different set of Shell scenarios. People really care about the environment? No, they don't. The economy's booming, the economy's collapsing. So you have a go for it world, a greener than thou. Again, that would be the Green New Deal. Tough times, smog rules. Once you have your 4 scenarios, tell the stories. This is how humans have always learned throughout history. We tell stories. Stories underpin many professions. They're very useful in business too. A story has a much higher emotional impact than an Excel spreadsheet. They help us look at complexity and make it understandable. And they enable us to take what we understand and apply that to the new world that's coming at us. So here are some of the plots. Somebody wins, somebody loses. There's a crisis, you do something about it. There's good news and bad news. Things change slowly, things change fast. There are cycles. Stories have a beginning, a middle, and an end. The Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, the coming of age, the hero departs, does a great deed, enters the abyss, and then returns home. Take a quadrant and work on it. Write the newspaper headlines that you think would appear in your world as the next period of time unfolds. What's happening? This is not a story about you. It's not about your organization. It's about the world out there. This is your way of understanding the world within which you are going to be doing business. Talk about it. Tell each other the stories. Take notes. Refine the scenario. Agree on the main themes. And record it. Again, it's a story, beginning, middle, end. What happens over the time frame in your world? Who wins, who loses, who are the characters? Then think about it. What are the implications of each of the different scenarios for your business and for your strategy? Will your strategy work if any of these worlds happen? If it won't in this particular world, but it goes gangbusters over here, it's really important that you start to watch what happens as we roll into the future. If the world is going this way and your strategy is not robust, you had best change your strategy in a hurry, because you've come to understand that your strategy won't work in this world. It'll work really well over here. And so if the future is moving this way, you can have pretty fair confidence. You can double down on that strategy. But if it's heading over here, you better be prepared to bail. How do you do this? Read the news. Look around you. What's happening? Don't try to convince yourself that it's going in the direction you want it to go. That's a fool's errand. Really look at what's happening and ask yourself, are we moving into the Green New Deal, or are we headed for Fortress World? Which of these is actually happening, and how do you know? Keep articles. This process either confirms your scenario logic or tells you it's time to do this again. This is the visualization of the Great Transitions Initiative, where they had business as usual, policy reform, the Great Transition, and Fortress World. This is how they built those scenario logics: individualism versus community, conventional development policies versus sustainable development policies. And they named each of the quadrants and described what was happening in each of these worlds. Each of these is plausible. What will the future be? We don't know. But this tool can enable you to move into the future with confidence that you can build a strategy which will enable you to prosper.